Okay, let's add something globally we can use to handle our exceptions, and whatever exception we get, we're going to return it in a standard way. When we're in development, it's going to be kind of similar to that developer exception page, but we'll also handle what we're going to send back for production as well. And what we'll do is we're going to create a new class, and we'll create a new folder for errors, and we'll call it errors. And inside here, what we're going to do is create a new class and call it API exception. And this is what we're going to be returning for any exceptions we get in our application. And this is going to have three properties. We're going to give it an int for the status code. We'll give it a string for the message. And we'll give it a string for the details, and the details in this case is really just going to be the stack trace that we get. In order to make this easier to use, what we'll do is we'll give this a constructor. So we'll put the cursor in the API exception, and what we want to do is use this generate constructor ... and press return, and this goes ahead and takes our properties and populates them inside the constructor. Now we always want a status code whatever happens, and this is for an exception, it's always going to be 500, but we'll make it clear in our code what we're doing there. The string of the message, we're going to give it an initial value of null, and we're going to do the same for the details as well. So if we don't provide a message and we don't provide the details, then both of these properties are just going to be set to null. And what we'll do next is we'll add some middleware to handle any exceptions. So we'll right click the API folder and create yet another new folder for this, and we'll call it middleware. And inside here we're going to create a new class, and we're just going to call this exception middleware. Now when we're using middleware, or we're adding middleware into our .NET API, we need to do certain things, and one of the things we need is a constructor for this. So we're going to generate a constructor, and what we need is something called a request delegate. And the request delegate is what's next, what's coming up next in the middleware pipeline. So we need to bring this in first of all, and we'll bring in using Microsoft ASPNET Core HTTP. What we'll also do is we'll bring in the iLogger so that we can still log out our exception into the terminal. We don't want to swallow our exception completely. We still want to display it in our terminal window where we're running .NET Run. This is useful information and we don't want to go without it. So we're going to bring in the exception, or we're going to use the iLogger, I should say, and give it a type of exception middleware, which is the name of our class. And we bring in using Microsoft Extensions logging, and we'll call this logger. And we also want to check what environment we're running in. Are we in production? Are we in development? And to do that, we'll use the iHost environment and call it env. And we'll also need to bring this in as well from Microsoft Extensions hosting. And what we'll do, we'll just initialize all of these fields from the parameter. And also for the env as well. And let's just bring this down so that I can see everything on the screen. So that's our constructor. These are the things that we need. And what we're going to do inside here is we're going to give this middleware its required method, and it's going to be an async task. And what we're doing here is we need to use the invoke async method. And let's bring in the task from system threading tasks. And then what we'll have access to is the HTTP context, and we're going to call that context. Because this is happening in the context of an HTTP request. When we add middleware, we have access to the actual HTTP request that's coming in. So inside this method, this is the place where we're going to be using try catch blocks. So what we're going to do is say try. And what we're going to try is say await and next. And we're going to pass in the HTTP context. So the first thing we're going to do is get our context and just simply pass this on to the next piece of middleware. Now, this piece of middleware is going to live at the very top of our middleware, and anything below this, if we have 17 bits of middleware, they're all going to invoke next at some point, and if any of them get an exception, they're going to throw the exception up and up and up until they reach something that can handle the exception. And then, because our exception middleware is going to be at the top of that tree, then we're going to catch the exception inside here. So we're going to say catch exception and say EX, and we'll need to bring in system to get access to the exception. And then what we're going to do is inside here, first of all, we're going to log the error, and we're going to say logger and log error, and we're going to say EX for the exception and EX message for what actually happened. And if we don't do this, then our exception is going to be silent in our terminal, and that's not great because we do want to see as much information as possible about what's happened with any exception. You may think it's cleaner to ignore this, but please don't, because it is important to keep getting as much information about the problems that you see as possible. What we'll do next is we're going to write out this exception to our response. So we've got access to the HTTP context, so what we're going to do is say context response and content type. We're going to set this equal to application JSON. And then what we're going to do is say context response dot status code is equal to, and we're going to cast this to an integer, and we're going to get the HTTP status code, and we'll need to bring in system.net for this, and then we're going to say internal server error. So it's effectively going to be a 500. And then what we're going to do is create a response. So we're going to say var response equals, and we're going to check to see what environment we're running in. Are we running in development mode? So we're going to say env and is development. And then what we'll do is we'll use a ternary operator to say what we're going to do if this is our development mode. And what we're going to do in here is we're going to create a new API exception using our own API exception class, and we'll bring in using API errors. And then what we'll do, we'll say context.response.statuscode, and then we'll pass in the message. We'll say x.message, and then we'll pass in the stack trace. And just in case this is null, we need to add the question mark there, and then we can say toString. We don't want to cause an exception in our exception handling middleware. Who knows what could happen then? We might break the internet. But just in case this is null, then we're going to prevent any exceptions from this by adding that question mark. And then what we'll do is, for the case where we're not in development mode, we know we're in production mode, then we're going to say new API exception, and we'll say context.response.statuscode. We'll keep the 500 error we send back, but what we'll put in the message, we won't give them any details. We'll just say internal server error. And then what we'll do is we'll create some options, because what we're going to do is send back this in JSON. Now, by default, we want our JSON responses to go back in camel case. So we're going to create some options to enable this, because we need to serialize this response into a JSON response. So I'm going to say var options, and we're going to say new JSON serializer options. And we're going to need to bring in system.text.json to use this. And then we're going to give it a property naming policy. So we'll open up curly brackets, and we're going to give it a property naming policy, and we're going to set this equal to JSON naming policy.camelcase. And this is just going to ensure that our response just goes back as a normal JSON formatted response in camel case. Then we're going to say var JSON equals JSON serializer, and we're going to serialize the response that we created earlier and pass in some options, as in the options are we want this to be in camel case. And then what we can do is say await, and we can say context.response, and we can say write async, and we can pass in the JSON response. And this is our middleware. And what we can do now is we can go back to our startup class, and regardless of which mode we're running in, we're just going to use our middleware. So we're going to say app.useMiddleware, and we're going to give it the type of our exception middleware. And that's all we need to do. And apart from, of course, bring in API middleware there. So what we should be able to see now is what we get in our response when we have an exception. So let's go take a look. And if we head back to Postman and we click on the same request, what we should see now is the JSON formatted response of our API exception. We can see the status code, we've got our message, and then we've got the details of this request. Notice that the toString method of the exception has some special functionality. It gives us new line, and we can use these inside. What we will do when we add an error handling page in Angular, we'll be able to display this in a somewhat more readable fashion, hopefully. It will still be a stack trace. So now we have our exception handling middleware. Any exception we have is going to be caught by our own middleware, and if we're running in development mode, we're going to see all of this. If we're not running in development mode, then what we'll see is a status code of 500 and a message of internal server error. So this is all we need to do on the API for the time being. What we're going to take a look at next is how we handle the errors in the client.